Hi, everyone. Just a couple of notes and comments before this week's episode, a Memorial Day kind of themed episode regarding Jewish soldiers during the Civil War in the Union Army. But a couple of comments here. So first of all, this week, Mr. Shem, I hope to get started on the Spain series that I've teased a couple of times here on the podcast and in the Mishpacha article over Pesach. We'll get started this week. That series is being generously sponsored by Glock Plumbing, who sponsored a previous series on the podcast about Shabtai Tzvi. So thank them again, and you'll hear more about them before each episode of this series. There are some other series in preparation, as well as numerous episodes. So that series is going to be released on Wednesdays, is the plan, but there will be regular kind of standard Sfarim Chatter episodes, quote-unquote, on Sundays. So if anyone would like to or is able to, I greatly appreciate to sponsor an episode or to support the podcast in a smaller monetary amount, less than full sponsorship. You can email me, nachi@sfarimchatter.com, or there'll be a link in the show's notes to PayPal. That way, to the website goes to PayPal, but otherwise you can email me for Zelle or for other things. Again, greatly appreciated. If anyone wants to sponsor or advertise or whatever it is, if you can, greatly appreciate it. Now, another note for those that listen to the bonus Prague Live from Prague episode with Yehuda Geberer of Jewish History Soundbites podcast and David Safir of Jenny Miller fame and other things as well, is that we kind of, because of the trip, we had this idea about redoing our Meshulam Igra, his Sfarim. And so for a couple of things. First of all, I mentioned on that podcast that he is the Rebbe of the Ksais. That's not true, but misspoke. But he is the Rebbe of the Netzivis, of Sali of Rupshitz, Baruch Tam, Mordechai Benet, probably, perhaps. But there's a lot. Anyways, regardless, and he was the predecessor of the Chassam Sofer in Pressburg, and he's buried there in Bratislava. So we had this idea his farm haven't been redone. And so, again, I got more into the story on that podcast. You can listen. So, we could put out an appeal on the podcast. Listeners have emailed with, pledges and my WhatsApp status, and I've been speaking to people. So right now we have about $35,000 of pledges, and the money is all going to Machon. I've spoken to Machon Alizayas, hopefully to redo it. We're not sure exactly what we're going to redo. He has Chuvas, he has Chedushim, he has Sefer Chut Igra Rama. There's a couple different things, mainly long, complicated pieces on Sugis. So it will require a lot of work. So if anyone is interested in pledging, we're trying to set up an online link. But if anyone is interested in pledging, contact me again, nachi@sfarimchatter.com. Doing this, working together with Davi Safir on this. So we're trying to do that. I would also point out something that's kind of related but separate. There's a very interesting biography of Meshul Meger. It was written called Gerim Hamaylas. It was written by Shevach or Knobel, about 100 years ago or so. Read it over Shavuot. Some very interesting things in there. So that also will hopefully redo, either put it in the front of the Shuvas or put it separately. That's a much cheaper project. If anyone's interested in biographies, they don't want to give money towards a sefer, but they want people to learn about Meshul Meger or whatever, you can contact me about that as well. Again, nachi@sfarimchatter.com. You can reach out if you're interested in that. And just about the podcast, as always, if you can subscribe and if you can rate and review, wherever, Spotify, Apple, etc. But if you can review on Apple Podcasts, if you can give a review, is greatly appreciated. And enjoy this week's episode. Hi, everyone. Welcome to another edition of the Sfarim Chatter podcast. On this episode of the podcast, I'm going to be joined by Professor Adam Mendelsohn, who is Associate Professor of History and Director of the Kaplan Center for Jewish Studies at the University of Cape Town in South Africa. And we'll be discussing his brand new book titled Jewish Soldiers in the Civil War, the Union Army, which was published by NYU Press and someone in conjunction with the Shapell Manuscript Foundation, the Shapell Roster. We'll talk about that as well, and Jews during the Civil War. So thank you, Professor Mendelsohn, for joining me.
Thank you so much for the invitation.
So let's start off. Tell the listeners a little bit about yourself and your background.
So as you described already, I am professor at the University of Cape Town. I direct the what we claim to be at least the only Jewish studies research center in South Africa and probably in Africa as well. And so a lot of my day job consists of work actually focused on the past, present, and thinking about the future of Jews in South Africa. But a lot of my own work, my own research focuses on American Jewish history. And in fact, this is partly how I originally became involved. But the reason I originally became involved in American Jewish history was in this thinking about comparisons between Jews in South Africa and Jews, particularly in the American South. And I worked on this at graduate school. Ultimately wanted to explore this topic further, and the rest in a way is history. And this project obviously comes out of my focus and interest in American Jewish history.
Right, because you sound like you're from South Africa, so it's interesting. Someone from South Africa, you teach in South Africa, but you got involved and interested in American Jewish history. This is something that you, like you said. So how did you come particularly to this one, to Jewish soldiers in the Civil War? And I'll just mention already now, this book's on the Union Army, forthcoming. We'll talk maybe about at the end. You're working on the Confederate Army. It's gonna be a bigger project. But how did you come to this particular topic?
So again, it's a good question. I in graduate school was very interested in the Civil War, and I had the good fortune of having in-laws who lived not far from Gettysburg. So I'd made plenty of trips to sites of battlefields and elsewhere. So it's both that sort of intimate personal interest, but also then began to work on what initially was just a small paper. Looking at what had been written about Jews in the Civil War, and there's scholarship which dates back to the early 20th century. There's a very important book by a rabbi historian by the name of Bertram Korn, which comes out in the early 1950s, and then there's a wave of scholarship which comes out really to mark the centenary of the war in the 1960s. And but not much since. So this was before the sesquicentennial, before the 150th anniversary of the war. And so I was interested. I really went and read everything which had been written on this topic, and looked at the patterns in that scholarship, and wrote a paper trying to understand the dominant themes in the literature, what had been covered, what hadn't been covered. And what was striking even then is that a lot of the work which had been done was on an important questions, anti-Semitism during the war, particularly General Grant's infamous General Orders Number 11. There had been work on Lincoln and the Jews, but very, very little on Jewish soldiers and understanding the everyday experience of Jewish soldiers in the army. So I noted that at the time, but that's a huge topic in its own right, as this book demonstrates. So I left it there. That graduate school essay ultimately formed the basis of a book that I co-edited with Jonathan Sarner, collecting the best writing on Jews in the Civil War. And that's a book we published again in 2011, but it was collecting existing articles rather than soliciting new work. And I was then approached several years later by the Shapell Manuscript Foundation, which has had this enormous project underway since 2009 to collect information about Jewish soldiers during the war. I was approached by them with a really an extraordinary offer, which was to use the database that they've been building, a whole team of researchers working away already for years by 2016, and given carte blanche, given license to use this collection and use the data that they'd collected, documents and all sorts of other material, to write a history of Jewish soldiers during the war. So it's really a dream come true for any historian to get access to material of this kind. And that's really how this particular project came out. It's really this collaboration between myself and the Shapell Manuscript Foundation, between them and their researchers. And this first book is the fruits of exactly this.
So let's talk a little bit about the Shapell Manuscript Foundation before we get into more of the actual book here. Why is it called that? Who started it? What is it exactly? Just overarching questions about what it is.
Absolutely. So the Shapell Manuscript Foundation is the creation of Benjamin Shapell, who has been almost a lifelong collector of historical material of a variety of different kinds, but with a strong interest in presidential material, historical letters, for example, of Lincoln and autograph material, etc. And also a very strong interest, particularly in the Civil War. And this particular project, which has been run by the Shapell Foundation, has sought to create a roster, a reliable, accurate, dependable roster of Jewish soldiers who fought during the war. And it builds upon an effort which dates right back to 1895, undertaken by a lawyer by the name of Simon Wolf, who's then the representative of B'nai B'rith in Washington, D.C. B'nai B'rith was then a very important organization in terms of representing Jews in much of the country, and he effectively served as its lobbyist in Washington, an important figure. He published, worked for many years, but then published a listing of Jews who had fought in not only the Civil War, but prior wars as well, the Revolutionary War, the Spanish-American War, etc., also after the Civil War. And it's really a project which was designed to respond to increasing anti-Semitism in American society at the time, to make the case that the Jews had bled for America and were patriotic and loyal citizens. And it's a sort of a resource. This original book, so used by historians for decades thereafter, because of all the data which is contained within it. But what Benjamin Shapell realized and recognized is that it is a very imperfect guide, and we knew it contained a variety of errors that other researchers had pointed this out prior to him initiating the Shapell Roster. But what he sought to do, and what then the team which he has worked with since have sought to do, is really to both correct the errors of Simon Wolf's work, and to add in hundreds of names of soldiers who were not identified by Simon Wolf, but also then to exclude those who were not Jewish. And it's a painstaking exercise, both because you have to identify who is a soldier, so you have to find service records, but also in a way a much more difficult question, identify who's a Jew, so to find verifiable evidence of exactly this. So it's a really professionally done initiative. And in the process, not only is there now a wonderful searchable database online, which anyone can use, and wonderful for genealogists and family historians and people interested in the Civil War, but also attached to each entry are the documents which they have identified as well. So it means that you can both find names in individuals, you can look at different regiments, you can look at a whole variety of other information, a large number of searchable fields that you can use when looking at the roster. But also you can pull up the documents which they have used. So service records, pension records, marriage records, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So it's a wonderful, and really for anyone interested in research, it's really a tremendous resource. And this, as I described, forms the foundation of my book.
Okay, and so another question about the Shapell Roster is that what is the methodology used to include names in there? I know there's an appendix in the book by Adrian de Armas discussing this. Perhaps you want to just mention a little how someone gets included or excluded from the roster.
Absolutely, it's a good question. So the roster team began with Simon Wolf's listing, and used that as a mechanism to identify some names, but also they cast their net much wider to look at a variety of, again, books and articles and newspaper clippings which have been published since Simon Wolf's work, which identified prospective candidates for inclusion. But every name which is now included in the roster has gone through this careful verification process, which requires positive identification. In other words, they have to find evidence of service, demonstrable evidence of service, so a service record, a pension record, some other evidence which irrefutably demonstrates that someone actually served in the Union Army. And the same when it comes to status as a Jew. Again, it could be a burial record in a Jewish cemetery, it could be a ketubah, it could be all sorts of other evidence of Jewishness. And as I described, that's really the much more challenging thing to find. It could be a listing on a congregational membership. It's all sorts of things of this kind. But it's has required enormous efforts on their part. And even though they've now finished the Union, they are still at work on the Confederacy, which is again equally difficult when it comes to proving Jewishness, but more complicated when it comes to demonstrating service, because the Confederacy was never as good when it came to record keeping as the Union, and also Confederate records, many of them were destroyed at the end of the war as well, when Richmond was captured. Lots of records were lost. So again, they're very much at work on this next dimension of the project, which is now trying to add to understanding of how many Jews fought in the Confederacy.
Okay, so first of all, generally, for listeners in the show's notes, I'll include a link to the Shapell Manuscript Foundation. People can check out the foundation and the roster. But just finally, just one more question about Shapell. I mean, so what is included? Generally, you go and you look online. Could you just explain to listeners what they can expect to go find there in this database?
Absolutely. So you can search by name. So if you're looking for particular people, you can certainly do that, and type in Cohen and you'll get lots of hits. But if you're looking for very specific names, you can do that too. So you can search using a name, or you can search using a regiment or a state, etc. So they're broader categories of broader mechanisms for searching. But then when you've actually identified an individual that you want to look at, you'll see both their name and potentially the aliases or the alternative names that they used when they enlisted. You'll see their service records, so the details we have about when they enlisted, when they were promoted or not, when they were discharged from the army, when they, for example, in some cases, were absent, etc. So again, drawing from their service records, but a quite detailed listing of the service record. Likewise, there is information. There are the documents themselves. So a whole listing, which could be everything from the obituary, the service record, the pension record, letters relating to that soldier. Again, and that varies. In some cases, it is a handful of documents. Sometimes it's much much more. And this is drawn really from the research efforts of the Shapell team, that they cast their net wide and have identified all sorts of documents of interest, which are again often very very rich in terms of understanding who this particular person was.
Okay, just one kind of final question. I know we keep saying to the listeners we're going to get into discussing the actual book, but so how did this factor into your research? You mentioned Simon Wolf's book, and you discussed that at length in the beginning of your book. But so how did this factor in, especially using the Shapell roster to, for new research?
Absolutely. So in two ways. Firstly, that it's obviously priceless to have verified names. I mean, to have verified information, and the sort of scale of research work, which would take probably a lifetime for one person. But obviously, there's been a team working in the background over here. But the other, so I could again draw on interesting case studies. I could dive into particular individuals and try and understand what their individual experience was. So there's that dimension. But the dimension I haven't spoken about yet, which is very, very valuable for my purposes for the book, was also to then look at scale as well, to be able to step back and look for patterns in the data as well. Is there anything distinctive about Jews in particular? Are there patterns in terms of age? How old people are when they enlist? Does this differ from other people who served during the war? Likewise, are there patterns in terms of origin, in terms of where people, most of these soldiers are immigrants from Central Europe? Are there patterns in terms of differences? If you are from Bavaria, is your war experience likely to be different from if you are from somewhere else within Central Europe? So those sort of differences, and likewise also to look at. I was able to look at, using this data, at what are the differences in terms of when you enlist as well. So if you enlist in 1861, at the beginning of the war, are you likely to be different from someone who enlists in 1864, 1865? So it's a whole variety of these hidden patterns which would not be apparent unless there was this enormous data set for me to look at and to analyze it in this way. And again, it's unusual for a project of this kind to be able to do quantitative research of this kind. It's rare within the broader field of Civil War studies, and it's rare likewise in Jewish studies as well, that to have data, reliable data of this kind, which you can ask these sort of questions of.
Okay, and Appendix 3 in the book is very nice, where it goes through, like what you're saying, there's a 2-page color, kind of, it's like a map, and it shows Jewish soldiers of the place of birth. It gives you the numbers where they're from. Then it says where Jewish soldiers enlisted. That's another 2-page map. Then there's Jewish soldiers by regiment. There's also the most common surnames, unusual service occupations. So you really get it's really nicely done in the appendix. I just wanted to mention that.
Good.
Okay, so now I think that we did more of a overview of various Shapell and general the book. So let's talk about actually the book and what happened. So, but before that, I think it's probably important. A lot of listeners probably are familiar with the Civil War, but if for those that aren't, and even for those that are, just to refresh so if you can, give a brief sketch, especially of the war and the major points of the war, especially as it pertains to our discussion.
Sure, absolutely. So it's a war which is a long time in coming, in the sense that there are major tensions between the North and South, which predate the war, which revolve around the slave question, about whether the United States should be a slaveholding society or whether not. And the 1850s are a deeply polarized period with heightening tensions, and all sorts of indications that America might well come apart at the seams, which it obviously does in 1861. The precipitating event is the election of Lincoln in November of 1860, which he's freely elected, democratically elected, but again, deeply divided electorate. He's elected by, in effect, by northern states. The vote in the South is divided, and his election is a step too far for a number of southern states, beginning with South Carolina, which secedes in December of 1860, and then is followed over the next number of months by other states as well. But there is until April of 1861, there is no war yet. In other words, there's still the possibility of some form of conciliation, some sort of solution, but that does not happen. Instead, the war will begin in 1861 in April in Charleston Harbor, where a federal garrison at Fort Sumter will be threatened, warned that they should leave federal property, leave the port, which is in the heart of Charleston Harbor, and unless they do so, they'll be fired upon. And they do not leave, and the firing upon Fort Sumter and then ultimately surrender Fort Sumter initiates the war. And initially, the neither North or South has a substantial army. The United States Army before the war was very, very small, 15,000 strong. And in the first year of the war, the numbers are much, much smaller than they will be later in the war itself. That initially, the Lincoln calls for the enlistment of 75,000 men. By the end of the war, more than 2 million men will serve in the Union Army. So it's a war which grows in scale over time. But in essence, the war in the East will be fought, or much of the war will be fought in Northern Virginia, because think about the proximity between Washington, D.C. and Richmond. So the decisive battles of 1861, 1862, 3, 4 will be fought in a very compact zone, again, often the same battlefields being fought over again and again. Likewise, in the Western theater, much of the fighting is along the Mississippi River again, but the terrain is much, much larger. In essence, there is the Confederacy, for the most part, knows that it's unlikely to be able to defeat the North entirely. So it plays for time. It wants to be able to, in essence, persuade foreign powers, including Britain and France, that they should recognize the Confederacy. So it needs to survive. It needs to defeat the Union Army in battle, but it can't necessarily hope to achieve genuine strategic military victory. And it does so really into 1863. And Gettysburg is one of these key turning points where effectively a Confederate invasion of the North is turned back. Relatively soon after, we see a change in command of the Union Army. We see Grant taking command, and we see a gradual and exceedingly bloody set of battles fought again in Northern Virginia, trying to move closer and closer to choke Richmond. And so hence, at least in the Eastern Theater, there's the battlefields are all tightly compressed in a relatively small area. Ultimately, victory comes both in the Eastern Theater with the once Richmond is taken, and the Western Theater with again a slightly different terrain, different progress of the war there, but with Sherman in effect, once he's captured Atlanta, moving his army through the South, the sort of trail of destruction left by his army, his march to the sea, demonstrating that the Confederacy has been hollowed out, cannot continue to wage war. So ultimately, by 1865, the Confederacy has no other choice but to effectively surrender.
You mentioned Richmond, Virginia. That's because that was the capital of the Confederacy, correct?
That's correct, absolutely, indeed.
Okay, so you mentioned just there and a few minutes ago as well about enlisting. So I think we should mention this here already, especially as it will come up very important for our discussion in the book, is that enlisting versus conscription. I mean, the United States Army still is, and it's an enlisting, it's a volunteer army. But was there conscription at any point in the war?
Absolutely. So as you correctly pointed out, it's initially a volunteer army, and it relies on mass enlistment, and there are inducements which are offered for enlistment as well. So people, there are enlistment bonuses, and bounties for enlistment, etc. But again, because particularly in 1861, 1862, the Union suffers a whole series of defeats on the battlefield and at great cost. That this war is anyone who reads a newspaper in 1861, 1862, anytime during the war, sees this visibly. The lists of casualties are enormous and are shocking. That it becomes increasingly difficult to find willing volunteers on the scale that is required. So therefore, conscription is introduced as a mechanism to persuade people to enlist. In fact, initially it's held over people that unless enlistment reaches a certain threshold, there will be conscription. But then there is also a conscription which is introduced later in the war as well. But most soldiers ultimately are actually volunteers rather than conscripts. And that's in the Union. And in the Confederacy, the picture is different, that their conscription is introduced much sooner, and a far larger percentage of the population will serve in the army, again, by not by choice necessarily, but by compulsion.
Okay, so start of the war, as you mentioned, 1861, the Union Army was smaller. It wasn't relatively speaking, it wasn't very large. So, I mean, how many Jews enlist at that point? And I think that goes hand in hand with how many Jews were in the United States, especially in the Union, because we're not talking about the Confederacy at this point. So how many Jews were there, and then how many enlist?
Absolutely. So again, we don't know with 100% certainty, but the best estimates are it's probably in the region of about 150,000 Jews in the United States in 1860, so before the war. And of those, the vast majority are in the states which will comprise the Union. So probably about 125,000 in the states which will comprise the Union, and about 25,000 in the South. And in terms of population distribution, most of them at the time are in terms of big cities will be in New York or Philadelphia or Cincinnati. But there's likewise a scattering of Jews in the countryside as well. That this is the great age of Jewish peddling, and small time shopkeeping and things of that kind. So we see a dispersion of Jews in really across the country already by this point in time.
Now, so then how many Jews enlist at the time? Do we know how many?
Absolutely. So initially, again, drawing on data from the roster, we can answer this question quite well, that there's a wave of enlistment right at the beginning of the war, that again, Jews are caught up in what historians describe as rage militaire, kind of the excitement of the coming of the war, the sense of that this is rallying to the flag and defending the homeland against Confederate aggression. So we see a lot of people enlisting. The single largest wave of enlistment is right at the beginning of the war, really April of 1861, and then numbers people continue to enlist. Across 1861 into 1860, but a gradual decline, really month by month, year by year. And then at various moments in time, it drops off quite significantly. That's particularly in response to a convergence of events, the loss of spectacular loss of the Battle of Fredericksburg, which is a Union military disaster, that it's an ill-conceived battle where there are enormous casualties. Likewise, which coincides with the coming of the Emancipation Proclamation, the freeing of the message from Lincoln that this war is now effectively a war against slaveholding, and also General Grant's General Orders Number 11. All these converge in a very, very tight space of time, and we see after that enlistment by Jews really will drop off quite dramatically. And it's difficult to work out exactly which one of these factors is the decisive one, but I suspect that all three together are on the minds of potential Jewish enlistees and on the minds of the Jewish population as well, because certainly we know that it's not just Jews who respond in a similar way to these crises in really sort of late 1862, early 1863. That it's also, and particularly Irish and German recruits or immigrants also begin to think twice before enlistment as well. They obviously don't have anti-Semitism on their mind, which is something which Jews are thinking about after General Grant's General Orders Number 11, but they are certainly thinking about the Emancipation Proclamation and thinking about the tremendous losses on the battlefield as exemplified by the disaster at Fredericksburg.
Okay, so first of all, you mentioned General Grant's General Order Number 11. We'll get back to that. And Jonathan Sarno's, you mentioned, has a book on that. We'll talk about Grant a little bit later. But as of this time, so you mentioned Irish, German. We should mention these Jews that enlist, especially at this time in the beginning of the war. Where are they from? So I mean that in a two-part way. Where are they from originally? Are they domestic? Are they foreign? And which states mainly are they living in currently when they enlist?
Absolutely. So they are mostly coming from Central Europe, although there are Jews from all over the place, in truth. Remember that the American Jewish population grows dramatically in the 1840s and 1850s. There's a wave of immigration from Central Europe. These are mostly economic immigrants, people coming for economic opportunity in America. So the American Jewish population goes from relatively small to this much larger population by 1860. So 150,000, much, much larger than it is in 1840. And so even though there are Jews from all over, most of them are coming from Central Europe, and there's no Germany at this point in time. There's a whole loose confederation of states and kingdoms and principalities in Central Europe, and so many of them are coming initially from Bavaria, but then from all over Central Europe, some from Eastern Europe already at this point too. And they are a diverse population as well, that they don't necessarily think of themselves yet as German Jews. They think of themselves often as Bavarian or as people from a particular locality or village or town. So one of the things I think that the war does is really create a sense of American Jewishness, that this is one of the consequences of the war. But in terms of enlistment patterns, once they're in America, where do Jewish soldiers come from? So it's the by far the largest Jewish population in America at the time is in New York, in New York City, and we see the single largest number of Jewish soldiers coming from New York. We see significant numbers coming from Philadelphia as well, but also from Ohio, particularly from Cincinnati. So it really tracks the distribution of Jews in America at this time, but with some variation. And I think that one of the things which the data from the Shapell Roster allows us to do is to demonstrate that there are certain places where Jews are more enthusiastic about the war and some places where they are less enthusiastic about the war. And this really tracks local politics, that New York City is not pro-Lincoln, not pro-the Republican Party in 1861. It's a democratic city, which at the time means that much more ambivalence potentially about the war, willingness to fight a war to preserve the Union, but not necessarily to fight a war to end slavery. And the same is true of Jews elsewhere, particularly Jews in Ohio. The same story, that they are in many cases living in towns and cities where the dominant political mood and is ambivalent about elements of the war. So Jewish enlistment reflects that as well. It reflects locality as much as anything else.
And one final question on the numbers. Do we know, I mean, proportionally, how many Jews enlisted versus to how many Jews there were compared to non-Jews, meaning like proportionally how many Jews really were there percentage-wise of the population, I guess.
Absolutely. The number of Jews is as a percentage of the population is very, very small in most places. But what I was able to do using comparative data with particularly Irish and German enlistees was to compare rates of Jewish enlistment with rates of non-Jewish German immigrants, for example. And we do see this interesting divergence there, that Jews don't behave in identical ways to Irish and other immigrants. And I make a whole set of arguments about why this is the case. And I suggest that in part this is because the economic role of Jews in American society is different at the time, that Jews are involved in commerce, they're shopkeepers, they're peddlers, and that they're not, for the most part, farm laborers, they're not working menial jobs in cities. And it entails a greater degree in some ways of sacrifice to enlist. If you started a business, you're going to have to abandon that business to enlist. That's one potential factor which explains the difference between Jews and other immigrant groups. Another factor is that we see, particularly with Germans and Irish immigrants, we see the development of what historians have described as ethnic champions, that we see local politicians, immigrant politicians, who basically try to rally their communities, their immigrant communities, to enlist. And often they're rewarded for this by becoming then officers in the Union Army. They're given officer positions in the army, and that requires a certain critical mass. That requires a significant number of Irish or German, a community on scale to do exactly this. And I think the Jewish community is too small to have ethnic champions of exactly this kind. And likewise, we see, even as we see enthusiasm and these efforts to mobilize immigrants by Irish and Germans, we see some of the opposite amongst Jews, that a number of significant Jewish communal leaders at the time, particularly rabbis, are ambivalent about the war. They want to keep American Jewry together. They're very worried about the consequences of a civil war. And so they don't rally around the flag in quite the same way that we see with other ethnic communities. So these two factors, I think, are important. And again, also, I think a third factor is locality, which I've already spoken to, that Jews are living in very particular places at the time in 1861 and during the war years. And again, this affects how they behave, that this shapes their surroundings, shape how they respond to the war as well. So again, Jews are behaving differently when it comes to enlistment. Obviously, once they have enlisted, their experience is going to be entirely different as well from other soldiers too.
So once you talked about the attitudes, the Jewish attitude towards the war, and especially communal leaders, rabbis, I mean, we could talk a little bit more about it here. You mentioned in the book Isaac Mayer Wise, was a Reform rabbi in Cincinnati, what he wrote, and Isaac Leeser in the Occident, in his newspaper from Philadelphia, and there are other rabbis. What is the general attitude? And I guess this maybe depends on city and locales of where they're coming from.
Yeah, so I mean, as you've correctly identified, so to two of the leading figures within American Jewry at the time. So both rabbis, one is a Reform rabbi, one is Orthodox, one in Philadelphia, one in Cincinnati. One thing they share in common, they don't get on in all sorts of ways. One thing they do share, that big personalities, one thing they do share in common is this ambivalence about the war. Lisa, some of it might be in part be personal, that he spends a formative period in his once he comes to America as a young man in Richmond, and he has family in Richmond, and so some of it might come from that, so that sense of connection with the South. When it comes to Isaac Mayer Wise, he's very concerned again about America being torn apart. I think Lisa shares that view as well. They both think that nothing good will come from this war, that this is an unnecessary and divisive conflict. Neither of them are in favor of abolitionism. And this is a more broadly shared view, I think, amongst many Jews at the time, because in part the abolitionist movement is very much intertwined with evangelical Christianity, particularly in the 1840s and 1850s. And many of the leading lights within the abolitionist movement are also involved in potentially wanting to convert Jews to Christianity. So that adds a an edge to this discomfort with abolitionism. It's real, as I described, real ambivalence about the coming of the war. And again, for I think many Jewish immigrants as well, beyond the leadership, as I've described earlier, they're economic immigrants who come to, for the most part. And there's a sense that the war is going to be massively disruptive and tremendously, its consequences tremendously uncertain. Certainly economically and socially, what will it do to American society? A view which is shared by many other immigrant groups as well. And again, a sense that what will it mean too when it comes to anti-Semitism? That's again a fear which is borne out by the war itself. That a moment of crisis in American society will unleash forces which are unpredictable and which may well involve targeting of Jews, and they're not far wrong about this. So all of these factors play into their thinking in the months before the war starts, and then once the war is underway as well. This real sense of ambivalence about the war. Again, there are examples of rabbis who do rally around the flag, but I think again that broader sense of ambivalence does partly explain how the broader Jewish population responds to the war as well.
Now, the anti-Semitism part plays in over here. I mean, on the same page 29 in the book, actually, there's a cartoon, and a lot of parts of the book I should mention, either on the page or in between on pages. They have this like light blue box, and it's kind of like a separate. There's a color pictures and some documents or some other history. It's a very nice creative decision to put different things in the book. It's not only like one narrative. I mean, it is, but there's also like stuck in between. You have like these little tidbits. So over there on page 29, there's a cartoon where you have anti-Semitic cartoon where the Jew is interested in money versus patriotism and helping the country. So it kind of goes both ways. I'm curious, to hear more about this, because on the one hand, you have, like you're saying, this leads to some sort of ambivalence, because why the Jews are being attacked, so they're just not interested in enlisting. On the other hand, them not enlisting leads to more anti-Semitism, right?
Absolutely, you absolutely. Your description is perfect. The sort of the circular problem here, that particularly in that first year of the war, there are scandals in the American press about the supply of the army. As I mentioned already, that the American army in before the war is tiny, 15,000 strong, tiny army, and which of course will be divided by the war itself. And it grows very quickly into a mass volunteer army. More than 2 million people will serve, and all those people need to be outfitted with uniforms and rifles and tents, etc., and all that needs to be manufactured. And there aren't again the systems to order this material en masse and to ensure that the contracts are clean and otherwise. So there are scandals in the beginning of the war about precisely this. And these scandals often take on an anti-Semitic tinge, where the term contractor and Jew is often used interchangeably in that first year of the war. And in fact, the term shoddy, which we now take for granted as to describe inferior goods, this term, it's actually a technical term to describe a type of wool which has been recycled and then should be used only as insulation. Instead, some unscrupulous contractors use this to make uniform jackets and pants, etc. And these uniforms collapse in the field, and hence these shoddy scandals. And so there's a wave of anti-Semitism very, very early on in the war, which undoubtedly affects the thinking of Jews about the war as well. That this is a shock to the system. That here we're being asked to potentially sacrifice our lives, being asked to join up, and at the same time we're being all these slurs about Jews in the press and cartoons of the kind which you've described as well.
Now, how does General Grant's order, General Order Number 11, play into this? You can describe to listeners what that was, and there's also some discussion in the book about what was leading up to that, and kind of how anti-Semitism, how does that play in?
Sure. So I tell you, can we break for 1 second? Sorry
Sure.
Yeah. So the Grant's order really builds on this broader wave of anti-Semitic sentiment in American society, which expands significantly during the war years. Again, think about the the experience on the home front during 1861, 1862, which is that there'd been a series of massive failures on the battlefield, frustration within the Union, again a casting around for explanation about why the Union, despite its obvious advantages in manpower and also in terms of industry, has failed. And so this generates both anti-Semitism and also likewise increasing hostility towards other ethnic and immigrant groups in American society as well. So that's the broader background. And when it comes to General Grant's order, we know that Grant harbors a set of negative views about Jews, which is not exclusive to him, that he's really picked up on this broader sentiment that I've described. And we see hostile comments which long precede his General Orders number 11. What's the specific context of General Orders number 11? So Grant is trying to capture Vicksburg. Vicksburg is on the Mississippi River. It's the fortress of the West, as it's often described. It controls access along the Mississippi, and Mississippi is really the vital artery at the time in the Midwest. And control of Vicksburg and of the Mississippi will be decisive for the Union during the war. So it's a major prize, a very, very difficult military objective to capture because it's a heavily fortified citadel, a fortress. And he is in the midst, this is in December of 1862, trying to capture in his campaigning down the Mississippi, but frustrated in a whole variety of ways. Militarily frustrated, but also frustrated because the Commerce Department has won a debate within the Union government with the War Department. The War Department doesn't want any civilian traders to be crossing Union lines, to be trading cotton, trying to acquire cotton to ship back to Massachusetts and elsewhere, to basically keep cotton mills running, to keep an industry which has suffered very badly because of the war, keep the textile business going. So the Commerce Department has made its case why it's important to acquire cotton from the very rich plantation territory along the Mississippi River. And Grant is deeply, deeply unhappy about this because he believes, quite correctly, that these traders are going to both exchange gold and other valuables with the cotton planters that they're doing business with, and that gold and other valuables will get back to the Confederacy and will fuel the war effort. So there's that concern. Likewise, is a concern that these cotton speculators who are crossing his lines will convey information about what his army is up to, where they are. So this is his deep unhappiness he's been forced to allow these cotton traders to operate, and he sees them as vultures, as locusts, flocking south to make enormous profits, while his men are sacrificing their lives to try and defeat the Confederacy. So deep unhappiness on his part. What is happening in the background as well is that some of these cotton speculators are Jews. They're a small minority of the total number, but it so happens that Jesse Grant, that Ulysses S. Grant's father, enters into a partnership with the Mack brothers of Cincinnati, a major clothing firm in Cincinnati, who in fact are supplying the Union Army with uniforms, which I've written about this in a previous book. The partnership is, in essence, to trade off the relationship between, or the expectation, I'm sure, is to trade off the relationship between Jesse Grant and his son to best advantage. In other words, that this will aid them in acquiring cotton, which can then be profitably sold. But they are amongst many, many other cotton traders, cotton speculators who are doing business during this period of time. But Grant hears of this and knows his father is about to arrive at his headquarters. And again, the best work on this has been done by Jonathan Sarna, in his book about General Grant expelling the Jews. And in essence, what he does, in I think a fit of rage, is to write this order, General Orders number 11, which in essence expels all Jews from the territory under his command within 24 hours. And the important point to know here is that the territory under his command, the military department under his command, is vast. It stretches the whole way up to Illinois at this point in time. And so it potentially, if enforced, would lead to the expulsion of hundreds of perfectly, if not thousands, of perfectly innocent, ordinary Jewish families who happen to live in this very large zone. But a number of factors intercede here, which intrude. One of which is that soon after the order is issued, his own one of his major supply bases is raided by Confederate cavalry, and this disrupts the transmission of this order. The other factor is that this order is transmitted to particular places, and from one of those places, we see the Jewish community rallying immediately to send a representative to Lincoln in Washington to lobby Lincoln to describe this order to him and to try and petition for executive action. And this is precisely what happens, that this is sort of literally an individual goes racing off from Paducah the whole way to Washington to petition Lincoln, and Lincoln hears of this order and immediately countermands this. And then it comes to, in fact, ultimately to haunt Grant later in his career, and that this is seen as rightfully seen as disgraceful action. He later, when he's president, really recants for this in a variety of ways. But it really, this episode reflects this mood at the time where again, it's casting around for villains, for explanation about why things are not going well, and really, again, provides this perfect distillation of the wartime environment and its challenges for Jews as well.
Okay, so I want to get to Lincoln in a minute here, because how he plays into this. But before this, how many Jewish soldiers at this time were serving under Grant, and how did the order affect the Jewish soldiers?
That's a good question. So there are, in fact, I haven't done that exercise of counting exactly how many Jewish soldiers there are. But he commands one of the major armies in the West at this point in time. So there are again plenty of Jewish soldiers who are directly affected. What I did look at were examples of how specific Jewish soldiers and officers respond to this. And we see a range of varied responses. But I think the common denominator is, as you would anticipate, is deep upset, deep unhappiness. Again, these are people who are sacrificing their potentially their lives for the United States, and are now serving under a commanding general who has made it clear that he treats and regards Jews, as he describes Jews, as a class, and he wants all Jews out of or least Jewish civilians out of the area in which he commands. So we see different responses. We know of some resignations, that Jews, for example, will resign their commissions, will leave the army. This is too disgraceful for them. Too much for them to bear with. And others, interesting again, those who have very good diaries and letters left by some soldiers. In some cases, for example, we have very curious moments of silence that a soldier called Marcus Spiegel, who writes frequently these really extraordinary letters to his wife. And he writes about all sorts of other things. He expresses his views about Grant on other occasions, and about his feelings about the war, and very, very openly at other moments. And here there's this curious silence, and I don't think it's an accident. That I think it's something which he is unable to bring himself to write about. And in fact, we know from a soldier who serves with him, who reports separately, a non-Jewish soldier reports separately, that he's not writing to his wife about this, but he is making it clear to his fellow officers that he's deeply, deeply hurt and upset by this. Again, later, he will come to regard Grant more highly, that Grant, at this point in time, he has had military successes under his belt, but this is actually a moment of, in a way, crisis in his military leadership. Later, he comes round in terms of his thinking about Grant, that Grant proves himself ultimately by capturing Vicksburg, and at that point, this Marcus Spiegel comes to reevaluate his views about Grant. But again, I think that unhappiness is entirely predictable. I mean, that this is, as Jonathan Sahn has described, the most notorious infamous act of anti-Semitism, a formal official anti-Semitism in American history, and to expect Jews to behave otherwise, as not being shocked, would be a surprise.
Yeah, and this time wasn't only Grant, as you include in the book, just one example from the Shapell manuscript collection, as you was titled in the book, Benjamin Butler, bigot, and the General Benjamin Butler is a notoriously anti-Semitic. I don't know if you want to talk about that. So there are other anti-Semites in going on in anti-Semitic comments being thrown around at this time.
Absolutely. And then I think what your point is a good one here, in that what's important for us to know that this is an era so different from our own, where bigotry of this kind, anti-Semitism, but also hostility towards Irish and Germans, is far more public and open, and people are bigoted in unapologetic ways. That this is the description of Jews or others in ways which to our ears today would be absolutely shocking, is taken for granted and is socially acceptable. And hence, Grant, I think Lincoln recognizes, and many others recognize, has gone too far. But there are those who defend Grant at the time. Likewise, we see a number of other senior and celebrated officers generals within the Union Army. So William Tecumseh Sherman, for example, shares Grant's views, also writes and says horrible things about Jews and about a variety of other immigrant groups as well. And then Benjamin Butler, who again is someone who's very much in the public eye, a political general in the sense he's had a very prominent pre-war political career, and is involved in taking a major step in terms of the emancipation of slaves, the effective emancipation of slaves who managed to find their way to territory which he commands. And this is the same man. On the one hand, he's saying, let us give liberty to slaves. On the other hand, he's saying, he's describing Jews as people who can never become American citizens, who are untrustworthy, who are, he uses the language, this language straight out of the traditional classic anti-Semitic ideas about the Jew as Judas, the Jew as someone who is only in it for himself and can never be trusted as a citizen of the United States. And this is again at the same moment in time when Jews are serving in the Union Army. I mean, imagine the shock of this. Imagine how horrifying this is, that you are simultaneously putting yourself at risk and hearing from those who have your life in their hands that you can never be a true patriot.
Yeah, he talks about Jews betrayed the Savior and betrayed us. I mean, he's talking about where they arrested 2 Jewish blockade runners, but it's written up on one page, and the other page there is a facsimile color of the manuscript of his letter.
And there's a final point about that. Also, what's striking is, as I've described it, how public that is, and that again, he engages in an exchange of letters with a prominent Jew in New York about this. But then it's all publicized. It's all in the press, and he does not apologize for it. He sticks to his guns. This is. These are his views, and they're socially acceptable views about Jews. So sort of a no apology approach to thinking this about Jews at the time.
So General Order Number 11 was in 1862. Do you have the number of statistics on how that affects enlistment afterwards?
Absolutely. So that it's as I was describing earlier, that coincides with both. Military disaster in the Eastern Theater, so at Fredericksburg, and also it coincides with the Emancipation Proclamation. There's a convergence in terms of timing, and we see an absolute collapse in terms of Jewish enlistment in the months thereafter. So the 6 months thereafter, we see the lowest level of Jewish enlistment during the war years. It will pick up again later, and I think it's this triple shock that there's why would you enlist in an army where commanding generals are saying these things about Jews? Why would you enlist in an army where soldiers are cannon fodder, as the Battle of Fredericksburg has demonstrated? And also, why would you enlist when the Emancipation Proclamation is disquieting to you? Where, again, and this interrelates with what we're talking about with General Benjamin Butler, that Butler is saying, we should emancipate the slaves. We should provide future citizenship, presumably to enslaved African Americans. On the other hand, we should treat Jews as a class apart. So again, all these things are swirling in the air at this moment in time, and they will certainly have a disastrous effect on Jewish emancipation, Jewish enlistment.
Okay, so one final thing, especially on Grant and just general anti-Semitic part, I wanted to talk about other parts of the book, is that is Lincoln and how Lincoln factors. And I know there is a separate book by Jonathan Sarna and Benjamin Shapell, and this Shapell manuscript foundation plays a part in different materials that we have. But just talk a little bit, even though it's not, it is mentioned in the book, but it's not the purpose of this book. But what do you have to say on that?
No, absolutely. So and as you correctly point out, that it's a really wonderful and beautifully illustrated book titled Lincoln and the Jews, and which looks at Lincoln's interconnections with and relationships with Jews, before he's president and during his presidency as well. And for my research purposes, also it's a priceless resource in that the Shapell Manuscript Foundation has a variety of original manuscripts of letters, etc., which relate to Lincoln's encounter with Jews, and particularly during the war years. That again, Lincoln, you get a real sense of his vision through his encounter with Jews. In that, again, Jews are a small minority of the population, but there is a conscious effort on his part to include them, and to recognition that there are symbolic things that you can do and should do. Again, symbolic politics to include Jews within the body politic. And part of this during the war years, for example, is to appoint Jewish officers. And there's a letter which I've included in my book, which is exactly this, where it talks about we need to appoint a Hebrew, and identifying a Jew for appointment to a position as officer. And Lincoln, I think, clearly understands in ways that Grant and Sherman and Butler do not, that in order to maintain to maintain the level of popular support for the war, which is essential to the continuance of the Union and the continuance of the war effort, you need to carry the population with you, and you need to think about immigrant and ethnic populations. So certainly, yes, Grant is paying attention to Germans and to Irish, many more Germans and Irish than there are Jews, but he's also thinking about Jews as well.
Okay, so moving a little away from the anti-Semitic part of the discussion, we'll play a little bit into the next question, is that what were Jewish experience generally like in the war? You mentioned there are bigotry and there are towards other, minorities or immigrants, immigrant groups, Irish, Germans, and others. And in general, what is the Jewish experience like because of this? And then just moving away from this question, just in general, in the army at the time.
So what sets Jews apart from other ethnic groups in the army? So about 20%, at least 20% of the Union Army comprises immigrants. So which is an extraordinary number. So probably higher than that, probably closer to a quarter of all soldiers in the Union Army are newcomers to America, and Jews are obviously, most Jews are at this point in time are immigrants, and some are native born, but most are immigrants. And what sets Jews apart from other ethnic groups, other immigrant groups in the army at the time, relates to a fact I spoke about much earlier, which is the fact that Jews are dispersed across America at this time. That yes, there are lots of Jews in New York City and Philadelphia and Cincinnati, but there also are Jews in small towns and all over the place because of their history as peddlers in the countryside, storekeepers in the countryside. So that economic role that Jews had fulfilled that leads to this dispersion of Jews. And what this means is that the common experience, the typical experience for a Jew in the army, is isolation. That unlike other immigrant or ethnic groups, if you are a German or if you are Irish, you typically serve or often serve in a regiment which might be a German or Irish regiment, in other words, where it might be dominated by your fellow immigrants, or even if it's not an ethnic regiment, where there are significant numbers of other Irish or German soldiers who share a common background, who share a common culture and concerns with you, alongside you. When it comes to Jews, more typical is to be one of a handful of Jewish soldiers within a regiment. A regiment is 1,000 men. So we're talking about a one or two, or sometimes at most, the regiments with the largest number of Jews, we're talking about with tens of Jews. That there's some there's one or two regiments with more than 50 Jews in them, but for the most part, Jews are serving alone or serving with one or two other fellow Jewish enlistees. And this means that it's difficult to be a Jew. It means that you really do stand out as different. It means that some Jews will conceal their identities, won't openly reveal that they are Jewish. And those that they do, in some cases, it means that they encounter a prejudice, that they encounter, in some cases, very, very nasty prejudice from their fellow soldiers, and sometimes support from their fellow soldiers as well. So sort of we have examples of both. But it means the implications of this for Jews who want to be Jews in the army are obvious, and that it's very difficult to be a observant Jew in any way if you are one of a handful of Jews in a particular regiment. That obviously, worshipping as a Jew is going to be challenging. You're, for the most part, you're in the field. You're away from a larger city where there's a congregation or a support network of some kind. You are going to the food that the army supplies is could not be less kosher. That the army subsists heavily on a diet of pork. So there's that challenge. And the army, again, the army nods towards observing the Sunday as a Sabbath. That again, that there's some allowances, for example, to soldiers who sometimes, at least, some soldiers who want to attend the worship service on Sunday, but certainly not Saturday. And likewise, that again, the army does make provision for chaplains, for military chaplains. It's something which really expands dramatically during the war years. Initially, the language which is used to recruit chaplains excludes Jews. It says that you have to be of a Christian denomination, so Jews are excluded. But once that is changed after much lobbying and the intervention of Lincoln, because regiments the officers of a regiment elect their own chaplain, that there are, there's one example we know of a regiment which elects which has allowed to keep a Jewish chaplain, and there are certainly Jewish hospital chaplains, but it means that again Jews are isolated. They aren't in terms of having someone to talk to and having someone to relate to and to break bread with who's Jewish is very rare. And this again will shape Jewish experience in a significant way.
Yeah, and the entire chapter in the book entitled "Sacred Duties," which discusses a lot of this. I mean, you talked about serving, religious functions, davening, and other things being religious. It was hard. And another thing, interestingly, just there's a lot of different, and throughout the book, you do discuss a lot of particular specific examples. You mentioned one, Joseph Levy, saying his daily pork ration was taking his tray for medicine for Uncle Sam. And I mean, there's people, I thought that was funny. He points out he's taking, he's eating, and again, you mentioned they're happy to eat tray, to eat pork, and even the non-pork was symbolic, the pork, but even the meat itself wasn't kosher that they had to eat. So I mean, there was a lot of it was complicated, right?
Absolutely, and I think a recognition that certainly the example you cited there, where that particular soldier he was writing to a Jewish newspaper about his experience. And there was I think he was trying to encourage people to his fellow Jews to sign up, but this sort of acknowledgement that it's not going to be easy, particularly if you want to be a traditional Jew in the army, to do so. And you'll have to. And one of the obvious sacrifices is going to come when it comes to kashrut. That it's going to be almost impossible to do so. Again, we know of effort. Again, Jews who go to tremendous effort to try and be as observant as they possibly can, but it is very, very difficult, and for all sorts of reasons.
Right, you mentioned Pesach and your Passover and davening. There's a lot in this chapter that you do talk about the stories. And another thing that was unique, I guess, I'm sure there were others to the Jewish experience, was that you have divided loyalties, and you do have Jews on both sides, especially because you mentioned the nature of them dispersed all over the country. So you did have Jews on both sides of the war. And you specifically mentioned in this book, there's the discussion about the Jonas family. There are others. Perhaps you can talk about what that kind of experience was like and what you've seen with the materials, how Jews, there could be even, the entire family except one siblings on the other side. So everyone's on the Union side and one's on the Confederate, or vice versa.
Absolutely. So it's a war which is often described as a war between brothers. And we do see examples, as you pointed out, of exactly this amongst Jewish families. That particularly given that Jews, the vast majority of Jews in America in 1861 are immigrants, and they often logically go to where there's opportunity, which means that siblings might be living in the same city, but likewise more often are dispersed, and we see plenty of examples of Jews where a sibling will be in the Confederacy and where, by choice or more often not by choice, will be obliged to join the Confederate Army, and likewise a sibling will be in the Union and will more likely willingly join the Union Army. And this is obviously a subject of tremendous concern, both for Jews and for others, is that the possibility that family might meet family on the battlefield, and it's again this sort of horrifying thought to people that their family members might literally be across the line, that you might be firing at someone who's dear to you. And again, it gets back to a point we were talking about earlier about how some rabbis respond to the war as well. So it's a real sense that this is a relatively small American Jewish population, and both for the general sort of spiritual welfare of American Jewry, that American Jewry divided in two is not going to be good, but likewise this horrifying prospect to religious leaders of the idea of family against family, brother against brother, again, I think plays on the minds of a number of Jewish communal leaders.
Okay, some other general things in the book, and we're bouncing around over here, but it's in this discussion is that high-ranking Jews and Jewish chaplain. I know it wasn't always so simple. As you mentioned, the army was very, I guess, Christian to an extent, and there was Sunday they observe as Saturday. So when do we have? What about high-ranking Jews and a Jewish chaplain in the army?
So initially, as I described, the chaplaincy is effectively closed to Jews, and this in fact becomes there's an effective test case around this early on in the war, that there's a regiment which is raised effectively in Pennsylvania or in Philadelphia, the 5th Pennsylvania Cavalry. It's a regiment where we see a Jewish commanding officer, Jewish colonel. We see other Jews amongst the officer corps, and they appoint for themselves a Jew to act as their chaplain. Once this is noticed, in effect, they are obliged to fire this individual as their chaplain, because he is not of a Christian denomination. And then this is widely publicized. It's a story which is picked up then by a major newspaper in New York at the time, and it becomes a sort of cause célèbre, something which is on the minds of certainly of Jews, but of others as well. That again, how can America discriminate against those who it's asking to fight on its behalf? And again, there's a lengthy lobbying campaign to change the language of the congressional statute away from Christian only chaplaincy. And ultimately, this is achieved partly with Lincoln's efforts. But again, the issue becomes that regiments select their chaplain on the basis, the officers vote for the chaplain. They have to select a chaplain. And there are, because of the reasons I described already, because Jews are dispersed across the Union Army, there are very few regiments which have a significant concentration of Jews within the officer corps, for example, and therefore we don't see an example. We only don't see an example of Jewish officers attempting to select a chaplain, with one exception, which is a chaplain who is ultimately appointed by a New York regiment. He is a rabbi who's had who comes with rabbinic ordination from Germany. He has a doctorate as well. He's a very learned man, less successful in America prior to the war. He bounces between pulpits. So the suggestion is that his preaching is very boring. He actually spends time in pulpits both in New York and then in the South as well, and then bounces back to the Union as well. And he has a difficult time within his regiment, and it's partly I think it's less related to the fact that he's a rabbi than to the nature of the regiment that he joins. It's a regiment which is typical of a number of regiments. It's a regiment which initially had a particular local character. It's a regiment regiments are raised in particular localities. It's a regiment which is then devastated during the war, massive loss of life, and it's a regiment which is then rebuilt with new conscripts. And he joins the regiment along with many of these new enlistees. He joins it at an unfortunate time. The regiment is going to be mauled again in battle. It's going to suffer great losses again. And it's commanded by a very, very difficult colonel who hates many, many people and comes to dislike this particular chaplain as well. He has someone else he wants for the role. But it's again a case where this chaplain struggles, as do many chaplains. It's not in no way distinct to him that the chaplains have a rough time in the army. So ultimately it's sort of it's a somewhat unsuccessful position that he holds as chaplain. But we do see more successful examples of Jews as hospital chaplains. That's again in centers and places like Philadelphia, where there are large numbers of military hospitals. We see Jews being appointed, rabbis being appointed as chaplains, and again identifying and caring for both Jewish soldiers and providing chaplaincy services to the general patient population as well.
Now, what about high-ranking Jews in the army?
So again, one of the interesting features of the Union Army is that we don't see Jews rising above the rank of colonel. Which is a very significant rank within the army. A colonel commands, a regiment commands 1,000 men, but at least, and there are Jews who will receive honorific, they'll be breveted at higher ranks, but won't, in terms of their active command, won't rise above the position of colonel. And we see an interesting variation in experience here, that there are some Jews who are appointed as colonel early on in the war, and they're generally individuals who've had military backgrounds either in Europe or in America. They've been involved in voluntary militias in America, in Philadelphia and elsewhere before the war, and they are rewarded by giving the command of regiments. So we see examples of that kind. And typically, not all of them, but typically they don't fare so well, that they again, pre-war military experience doesn't translate necessarily very well into real experience on the battlefield during the war. And so a number of them fail, which is typical of many colonels who are appointed early on in the war. But more interesting are those who rise through the ranks. And we see a number of Jewish officers rising from quite junior positions to become particularly lieutenant colonels within regiments, again, playing key roles in the war. And one of my favorite examples of this is the man whose photograph is on the cover of the book. This is a man whose surname is Solomon, who again rises through the ranks and then has really quite extraordinary war. When I went searching for his career, much like it's almost sort of a Forrest Gump-like experience, the military version of a Forrest Gump-like experience, which he most of his time is spent in the Western theater. So spent under Sherman's command, and Grant and then Sherman's command, and battle after battle, particularly in the campaign to Atlanta, and then afterwards in the campaign in the Carolinas. His regiment under his command appears with him in command at critical moments in battles where and it's written about in accounts of these battles that his regiment appears at the critical moment to turn the tide, that there's a gap in the line and there he is with his men, that they charge at the right moment. And so clearly he's someone who's very skilled and has a large element of good fortune, of good luck as well. But what's striking about him is that despite the fact that he is tremendously successful in command, he doesn't rise beyond the rank, at least during the war, of lieutenant colonel. Later, he's breveted, he's given these honorary promotions. And again, I describe this in the book as sort of a number of theories why this is the case, that this is someone clearly deserving of promotion, but who isn't ultimately promoted.
Yeah, for those interested in seeing his picture, again, I don't know, actually, maybe I didn't mention this. The link to the book will be in the show's notes, so you can click that and you can just see it on the cover of the book. You do mention a couple of these soldiers, even though they don't rise higher than colonel, they do get, post-war, they get higher titles. So that's something in chapter 6, Lost and Found, you discuss, first of all, a Leopold Carpellus and others. There are others, heroic acts, but somehow they're kind of forgotten after the war. I don't know if you want to say his story, you can if you want, but what happens that suddenly the veterans become kind of invisible? And then
Absolutely. So it's a very interesting, real surprise when I was working on the book, that to discover exactly this, that there's a real silence after the war within the Jewish community in terms of talking about Jewish wartime service. That I know that, again, in the 1890s, that there's much celebration and much talk about Jewish wartime service. But in the decades immediately after the war, instead, there's reticence, yes, Jewish veterans join veterans organizations, and they're celebrated in veterans organizations. So Solomon, who I spoke about a moment ago, that he again is a celebrated figure, is rewarded for his wartime services, appointed as governor of the Washington Territory by grant, etc. So he has this glorious post-war experience. But in terms of inside the Jewish community, there is a real reluctance to talk about the war, that it sort of drops from the pages of the Jewish press. It becomes this uncomfortable topic into my mind after the war. And my argument is that it's largely related to things we've spoken about already, that the war generates a new form of anti-Semitism in American society, that never have Jews really been troubled in the way that they are during the war by anti-Semitism, and that does not disappear after the war, that there are these negative memories about the war. Again, desire to move on. Why would we want to talk about the war when it's associated in our minds with General Grant's General Orders No. 11 and other episodes of anti-Semitism? So we want to move on. We want to focus on the future. Talking about the war is disquieting. It might dredge up these negative memories, and much better to focus on the future. So there's this long period when the Jewish community doesn't talk about the war, where it doesn't talk about veterans, and there isn't a Jewish veterans organization yet. All of that will come in the 1890s, and the war returns to Jewish attention because of the rise of anti-Semitism connected with the mass immigration of Jews from Eastern Europe. That we suddenly see, again, full throttle return to the claims of the kind made by Benjamin Butler during the war years, that Jews can never be citizens, that Jews should not be allowed to settle in America because they are inherently un-American, they can never fit in. All of those things explode with Eastern European mass migration. And in response to that, the Jewish community, or parts of the Jewish community, seize upon the Civil War. They say that, wait a second, the greatest way for us to prove that we are good citizens and that we are patriotic and that we deserve to be here, and that future Jews, that Jews who are arriving now will become excellent Americans, is by pointing to Jewish wartime service. That this is the bedrock on which we can build our case for the inclusion of Jews in American society. So we see this. Simon Wolf's project, which we started speaking about right at the beginning, emerging out of exactly that. There's this desire to demonstrate that Jews are good Americans, and what better way to do it than to talk about a war which is still in recent memory in the 1890s, that the war is again has been spoken about more and more by Americans during the same decade, and Jews are doing the same thing.
So is that reason why it's important to you, in your mind, to know this book and this research, to know how many Jews served in the army, where they were from, and that kind of thing? Or is there another reason about why it's important for us to know this?
So I think that my motivations are different from that of Simon Wolf, and I think the Shapell Foundation motives are different too. That yes, I think there is a very good reason to want to record and in a way also celebrate Jews who served very honorably, but it's not for apologetic purposes, not to prove that Jews are good Americans. We take that for granted. I mean, why would we doubt that in any way? But instead, that these are people who most of them immigrants who decided to put their lives at risk for a country that they'd recently joined, that they'd recently settled in, and also to recognize how challenging and difficult and that was for them, the sacrifices they had to make to recognize, anonymous individuals. Most of these are people who particularly those who died in service, or people who are long since forgotten. Many of them, their graves are not visited. To recognize that there's something important here which is worthy of remembrance and worthy of recognition. Also, I think that there are interesting echoes of the past and the present again now, that we obviously live in a very politicized and polarized moment in time, and to recognize again complexity here, that Jews respond to the war in all sorts of complicated ways, which reflect the dynamism and challenges of American society at the time. That in retrospect everything is straightforward, but at the time things are not straightforward. To recognize that we also live in this complicated moment when again the sort of our political thinking, the context which we live in are challenging and complicated, and to recognize that we also live in a polarized moment too, where there are all sorts of resonances from the past as well.
Okay, so I will put a link to the show's notes. Put a link to the book in the show's notes. Sorry, and the book is it's actually nice. I just describe it. It's a little bit larger than a regular book. It's glossy pages. There's color photographs. A lot of the color photographs are just colored scans of other documents. But like I mentioned, that really nice feature of in between various pages, and on the pages, they have, there's a lot of pictures of cartoons or manuscripts or letters or different things, or which is pictures if we have any pictures and that kind of thing. And it's a very nice book, and there's the appendices in the back as well. So just as a final question, you are now, I believe, so as I mentioned earlier, this is on the Union Army. You're now working on a book on the Confederate Army. How does that, just as in brief, we're not going to, we can talk again when that book comes out, but how is that project coming along? How does that differ or similar to this one?
Absolutely. Well, I'll hold you to that. There are very striking differences. I initially set out to write a single book about Jews in the Union, Jews in Confederacy. One of the reasons why there are now two books, or will be two books, is because the experience of Jews in Confederacy is very different. We see the Jews who are much more prominent in the Confederacy than in the Union. That the Secretary of War for a time is Jewish. That Judah P. Benjamin is the Attorney General for a time. He's the Secretary of War, and for the longest period during the war, he's Secretary of State, an immensely important figure within the Confederate cabinet. So we see prominence, Jews who are very prominent within, and other ways too. Other officials, other Jewish officials, also very prominent too. So we see that. Likewise, we see other patterns which are different as well, and one of which I'm struck by now, and I've been reading, spent the last now many months reading memoirs and letters and diaries left by Jewish soldiers, is there are many more letters and diaries and memoirs, which is wonderful for historians. So he's really talking about their thinking and experiences, but also there's this a differentiated experience, that there are some Jews who are committed to the cause from the start, or others who become very committed during the war years. But many Jews, because of conscription in the Confederacy, it becomes very difficult to evade conscription. Many Jews are very, very diffident about having to serve, and will try very hard to get out of serving in the army. They'll serve for a time and then try to get out, because they are recognized that this is not a cause they want to die for, or prepared to die for, and also because it's a very, very dangerous cause to serve as well. So again, these interesting differences, that because of conscription and because of the breadth of conscription in the Confederacy, it means that it sweeps up many more, and a far larger percentage of the Jewish population than it does in the Union, where enlistment is voluntary, and service for the most part is voluntary.
Okay, looking forward to that. I also wanted to mention that I'll put a link in the show's notes as well to other books that we discussed. We mentioned the Lincoln book and the Grant book. I'll put those as well if anyone's interested. They can see them as well, and of course to this book, and also a link to the Shapell Manuscript Foundation that people can of course check out. We discussed that I realized we discussed that in the beginning, and a lot of this book is really built on that and what they did, and that's really what you used. So if anyone's interested in seeing more about these primary sources, should go check that out as well. And with that, thank you very much, Professor Mendelsohn, for joining me.
Thank you. Thank you for a very good conversation. Thanks.